So let's get started, people. Everybody ready? So let me welcome everybody. We already have past 50 people in the audience, and we're already on time. So I just want to welcome everybody to this session on economic opportunities and crime. Let me first thank Eduardo Feingold for the opportunity to organize this session. And also I want to congratulate both Eduardo and Marcelo for the outstanding job they did in organizing the SB conference this year under obviously very challenging circumstances. And it's been really a very, very nice conference. And this session is just one of the many examples of how successful it has been. And I want to thank Maria Michaela Sviati and Paolo Pinotti, our speakers, for accepting the invitation. So Mika is an assistant professor of economics at Princeton, and Paolo is endowed professor in the economic analysis of crime and associate professor of economics at Bocconi. And it's just a pity that you're not here. And I promise you that this is not going to crawl out a future invitation that you're going to be able to come in person, both of you. Both Mika and Paulo have been doing some very, very interesting work at the frontier in economics of crime, and the papers that they're going to present today are examples of this. Both of these papers are actually under revised and resubmit at Econometria, it's also a very good omen for people doing research in economics of crime. So people are breaking through into the very top journals in the profession. And both of these papers, they actually explore different dimensions of the economic impacts of economic opportunities on crime, different types of economic opportunities. That's going to be clear. So the rules of the game are going to be basically, I'm going to give 35 minutes for each presentation with a few minutes of tolerance. And then we're going to have roughly 10 minutes of questions for each speaker immediately after the presentation. In terms of questions, I'm going to ask people to keep the questions to a minimum during the presentation. So just really clarification questions. And then in the end, you can either ask it directly using the mic or just send a message through the chat and I can read it to Mika or Paulo. And please be aware of your mic as well. Don't leave it open in the middle of the presentation. So Mika, thank you so much. The floor is yours. I'm gonna let you know when you have 5 minutes to go, okay?
Perfect, sounds great. Thank you so much everyone for attending and for inviting me, Rodrigo. I'm very happy to present this work. Basically, I'm going to explore how childhood exposure to illegal labor markets during childhood can determine criminal life path, in particular in the drug industry. So let me motivate this paper with a quote from the leader of the Sinaloa drug cartel, El Chapo Guzmán, when asked how he became a leader of this big cartel. And actually what we can see is that he started at a very young age growing opium and marijuana. Moreover, there are multiple biographies that say that he started working with his father, who was an opium farmer like everyone else in this branch and town called La Tuna. And two things we can get from the story of El Chapo, if you read his biography. First is that his career in the drug industry started at a very young age, so early that by the age of 15, he was having his own plots and selling his own products. And second, that there is something in the locations and conditions during childhood that put him in that criminal path in the drug industry. Perhaps if we would think that El Chapo would have grown up in an area suitable for coffee, his path would be very different than the one that we observe today. So in this paper, what I do is to exploit administrative data on incarcerations, school, geocoded location, and coca production in Peru to provide causal evidence that criminal careers can be the result of exposure to illegal labor markets during childhood. In particular, what I'm going to show is that growing up in cocaine-producing areas can have long-term consequences. So to do so, I take advantage of a shock to the demand of child labor that basically increase the return of an illegal activity. And when this return of an illegal activity increase, parents significantly increase the use of child labor in coca farming, putting their kids on a criminal path. Then the second thing that I'm going to do is to analyze the mechanism here. So why does this happen? What happened? Why are we seeing, what is it about working in coca farming as a kid that put you in a criminal path? And here, what I'm going to argue is that these children, instead of being developing formal human capital at school, they are likely learning how to navigate the drug trade, learning some type of criminal capital. And here with criminal capital, I'm going to be broad. What I mean is maybe like knowledge about how to transform coke into cocaine, and also contact with other stages of production. And then as the third part of the paper, hopefully we have time, I want to study how a specific policy that target these mechanisms, this development of criminal capital during childhood, can mitigate criminal careers. So to answer the first question, as identification, what I'm going to do is to explore variation across locations with different coca suitability and price changes over time and across cohorts. So how do I obtain these sources of variation? Is that I take advantage of a large anti-drug policy that happened in Colombia, which basically shift cocaine production to Peru, to areas that were suitable to produce coca. So for you to have an idea, around 17 years ago, Colombia was the main producer of cocaine worldwide. Then as part of this US war on drugs, Colombia started an eradication program of coca, which consists in this aerial spraying that you must have seen in the news, which consists in the aerial spraying of all coca crops. So what happened? This resulted in increasing coca prices, and this shift cocaine production to Peru, to areas that are suitable to produce coca. And for a while, Peru was the largest producer of cocaine and coca worldwide. And this had a large effect in children. And let me tell you why in children, because actually traditionally in Peru, children that are in the transition between primary and secondary education are more likely to drop out from school and participate in the labor market. So what I'm going to exploit is these three sources of variation. So first, this variation in prices, in black market prices of coca before and after the Colombian shock. Then the variation of cross-section across areas with different coca suitability, and also variation in the ages of exposure to the shock. So the idea is that this increase in coca prices had a higher effect in areas in Peru that are suitable for coca, and that within these areas, it affected a cohort of children more. So I'm not only going to be comparing places that have higher versus low coca suitability over time, but also individuals that were born in the same place, but were exposed to high coca prices at different ages. And then to analyze the mechanisms, I'm going to analyze the effects by different types of crimes. So to crimes that are more associated to the drug industry. And I also am going to compare how these effects vary if you are exposed to shocks to legal commodities. Because right now I'm only talking about illegal markets. The preview of the results is that I found that actually individuals that are exposed during childhood, in the short run, we see an increase in child labor in coca farming in these areas that are suitable for coca. They are also affected in intensive margin. We see lower test scores, higher age for grades, and higher dropout at the ages that happen in Peru, which is the transition between primary and secondary education. And we also see that there are long-term consequences. We see that when they are 18 to 30 years old, they are 30% more likely to be incarcerated at less exposed cohorts. So basically the ones that were experiencing the high coca prices at the 11, 14 ages, which were when child labor and dropouts occur, we see that they are more likely to be incarcerated than the people that were younger or older. And I also find some evidence that the development of criminal capital can be driving these results. First, I find that the effects are mostly for drug-related crimes and violent crimes like homicides that are very related with this industry. And then, interestingly, I find that shocks to commodities in the legal sector that also have the similar effect in magnitude in child labor do not lead to future criminality. And something very nice of the case of Peru is that coca has this tradition for the indigenous community. So there are certain areas that they produce for the legal sector. So I check how shocks to prices to coca in the legal sector affect child labor in the short run and in the future. And what I see is that even though they increase child labor, there is no effect on future criminality. So from these results, from this period of the result, it seems that reducing, basically affecting changing parental incentives can place children on a non-criminal path, given that all the effects are driven during childhood. So as a next step, I explored the rollout of a conditional cash transfer meant to incentivize schooling. This was like the typical conditional cash transfer that they give a transfer with the condition that the kid had to attend school, and it was not intended to reduce drug production. So you can think of this shock as the opposite of the Colombian shock, as something that now is increasing the opportunity cost of child labor. And what I'm trying to do with this is two things. First is to disentangle the mechanisms, whether the mechanisms are coming through human capital investments during childhood, during the key ages, and also to shed light on policies to mitigate criminal careers. For instance, something that I do and I will not have time to do is how can we maximize the effects of these conditional cash transfers given potential spillovers that may happen in the drug industry? And as a previous, the results consistent with this idea that parental incentives matters, we find that in COCA suitable areas, the conditional cash transfer actually decreased child labor. We see the improvement in schooling, and we find a decline in COCA production because children are an important input of production and potentially reduce future criminality. However, as I was saying before, everything is not that perfect because we see that there are some percent of spillovers, so an increase in coca production and child labor in surrounding districts. But however, the nice thing with this is that since cocaine is in general can be produced in coca they produce in places that are suitable for coca, we can predict where all these placements of these spillovers occur. So we can reduce this if targeting takes into account the coca suitability of these neighboring districts. So this is the summary of what I just showed you before. So basically we have the shock of Colombia, the increased prices of coca in Peru. We see an increase of child labor, reduction in schooling. We are going to have two channels. One is a reduction in education and increase in criminal capital. I'm going to focus on this in incarceration, but I also see effects of lower reported earnings. And then we're going to explore how this policy can break this cycle. So let me give you a bit more of background. So most of the world cocaine that we see today comes from coca grown in the Indian region in South America. And 90% of the coca is used to produce cocaine. So, and this coca is only produced, as I was saying, by 3 countries, Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia. So any changes in drug policy in any of these countries will shift production to the other one, because these are the only ones that have the optimal agroecological conditions. For you to have an idea, here in this graph, I show coca production over time. In the 90s, Peru was actually the main producer of coca. But then again, the US war on drugs, they shut down the main air bridge that used to transport drugs outside of the country, and production shift to Colombia. Then in the 2000s, again, in Colombia now, they started this aerial spraying that I'm going to focus, and production went back to Peru to some extent that, as I was telling you, at some point it was the largest producer of coca, and also if I show you of cocaine, it was also the largest producer of cocaine. And this had actually a large effect on children. So when I started this project, there was a lot of qualitative evidence saying that child labor was common in these areas. So I went to these locations and I spent more like 3 months trying to interview people and getting like more qualitative evidence about how this industry worked for kids. And it was very common to see children picking coca leaves there in the field. And the answer is very simple. This is very low skill. It's just taking leaves and then put into dry and then take it to these maceration pits where they transform coca into cocaine paste. And it's something that the children, they can do without any supervision. It's not like with coffee that you have to have certain skill to know which is the right bean or something. No, here it's just, you need to take the leaves and these kids can do it with any adult nearby. And the other advantage that it has is that it requires a lot of labor because different than other crops, it can be harvested all year. So children can be the whole day working here. Like for instance, they were telling me that they work from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. every day. Some of them, they would combine it with school, especially the younger kids. And instead, the older ones, the ones that were, especially the ones that I told you that were the early teens, those were not only collecting coca leaves, but then also were the ones that they would carry these leaves and take them to these next stages of production. So those were the most affected. And also they use kids because they cannot be legally prosecuted. And this is such a big issue actually in Peru that for the International Labour Organization, they classify actually coca farming and also processing as one of the worst forms of child labor. This is a very nice quote that actually describes this paper pretty well. It says, a child that grows up in a coca valley in this rural Peru will follow an employment cycle in the drug industry. First, we will have a cocalero, which means a coca farmer, then a posero, which means transforming coca into cocaine, and later a mochilero, which means a cocaine backpacker. So it wouldn't be strange that this early start in the business leads him to be a drug trafficker or sicario. And this is what I'm trying to explore, how all this cycle puts these people into this type of crimes. So how I do it is, and I go very fast through the data, because I know that this is very boring, but basically what I will have is cross-sectional data on production. Of course, I don't have cocaine production, but I do have the number of hectares by district. So I have some historical measure of production. And I also have satellite images, which shows the exact location of these coca farms. So, and this is something part of a program of the UN, which basically they verify this by basically going to some of these areas and checking if there are these coca crops there. And then I also construct my own coca suitability index based on the model that the FAO proposed. Then in terms of time series variation, coca prices, I also get them from the black market, and it's part of this UN program. And I also get information from Colombia which are where the coca hectares they are. In terms of the outcomes, what I'm going to use, so something nice that I have is that I have a child labor from household surveys for the whole period. The only negative of this is that I can only merge it at the district level. There are about 2,000 districts in Peru, and I can so link it to the measures that are a bit more aggregate. But the nice is that I also have the school census, which are geocoded. So here I can do even a better job because I can be able to compare within a district year schools that were located in high coca suitable areas versus those that are in low suitability. And then something nice is that I have information, administrative data incarcerated for the year 2015 and 2016, which tells you the exact district of birth and also the village of birth. So again, I will be able to do this district by year fixed effects. And they tell you the type of crime. So this is a map of Peru for you to have. This is where historically coca was produced in 1994. When you remember that at the beginning, I told you that in the graph that they were big producers. And this in the 2000s, as you can see, mostly is concentrated in the districts that used to produce. So which will be the identification strategy? It will be very simple. This will be a difference in differences where I'm going to be interacted. These coca suitability measures at the district level interacted with the price of coca in the black market in year T. And I'm also going to include district fixed effects, year fixed effects. And since Peru is one of the main coca producers, so you may think that price can be endogenous, I'm also going to instrument by the number of hectares in Colombia. And for the data I have at the lower level, for like the case of the schools, then it will be done at the school level rather than districts, but the strategy will be the same. Like the interaction, the only thing is that you will include school fixed effects instead of districts. So as a first result, as I told you before, we see this is here we are estimating the effects on child labor by different ages. So we divided based on the cycles. This is like basically primary school. This is the transition that I was telling you that in general people drop out. And this is the last years of secondary schools, of high school. And this is other ages. And what we see is that this is pretty consistent with the qualitative evidence. In general, younger kids, they participate, but they also, as I was saying, don't participate fully. We see the largest effect at these ages of the transition, because these are the kids that not only collect the coca leaves, but also take them to the next steps. And then we don't see any effects at older ages. Then in terms of education, so here what I do is basically I study the effects first on enrollment, then dropout, and then the characteristics at intensive margin. And what we can see is that enrollment is only affected by these ages that were the key ones that traditionally in Peru they drop out, but we don't see any effects at the other ages. And again, this is because kids here at these stages, they combine school with collecting the coca leaves. And these are the ones that they decide to drop out to school to fully participate in the business. And as you can see, these ones are not, the older ones are not affected in the intensive margin. Instead, the little ones, we don't see any effects in enrollment or dropout, but they are doing much worse in school because they are combining their effort schools with also collecting coca leaves. So I do a bunch of robustness checks, but for a matter of time, I'm going to skip. So maybe in the questions we can go back. But let me only mention something that is very important, that basically you may be thinking how these effects are driven by also violence. And actually, I tried to measure the effects on violence using a lot of different measures like conflict, crime, and everything, and we don't see any effects. And the reason for this is that unlike Colombia, when cocaine expanded in Peru, there were no pre-existing armed groups fighting for the control of the cocaine trade when the returns increased in the 2000s. Instead, in Colombia, because we see that when there is some literature that shows that when cocaine production starts, there is like a big increase in conflict. It's because they were already pre-existing armed groups there. But in the case of Peru, that was not the case in this period. And also, the other reason is that the Peruvian government, different than the Colombian, they did not have a strong enforcement in this area. So I think that this was very important. Then there are other robustness checks that I do, but it's important for you to keep in mind in your story that it's not that you enter into these areas and there are shootings or group fightings. And also how it's structured, the business is very different because there are a few families that basically rely a lot on social capital. So for now, I only show you the short run effects. So now let's see what happens in the long run for these kids. So the strategy here will be to basically compare incarceration rates of people that experience low prices and high prices at different ages of childhood, and some were born in coca areas and some were born in non-coca areas. For example, and here what it shows is that if you experience high coca prices in key ages and you were born in coca areas, you are 30% more likely to be incarcerated than if you were born, you experienced high coca prices, but you were in another area which was not suitable for coca. This is just a descriptive, doesn't have anything, but at least it's useful to understand the identification strategy. So just to put it formally, now what I'm going to do is basically interact the prices that you have at different ages of childhood with the coca suitability of your district of birth. And for the cases that I have the village of birth, which is much smaller, would be the village of birth. And here, instead of putting year fixed effect, we have cohort fixed effects, district of birth fixed effects, and a bunch of robustness check. And this graph shows it very clearly. What we see is that the effects start increasing in these stages where we saw most of the dropout and the largest increase in child labor, which makes completely sense because, as I told you before, these are the kids that they drop out from school to fully participate, not only collecting the coca leaves, but also they have a contact with other stages of production. And the effects we also check by type of crimes are much larger also in drugs, like 60% much larger. And again, this is also robust to this specification by including district by year of birth fixed effects for those people that I know the village of birth. This is like almost like 70% of the sample. This is useful because it kind of rule out enforcement decisions that are made at the district level. So let's go now. How long do I have? I'm going very fast. I'm okay.
You're okay on time. Yeah, you have like 10 minutes. Yeah.
Perfect, great. So we saw that there is this increase in incarceration, in particular with drug crimes. I didn't show you for other crimes, but actually I also checked for sexual crimes, violent crimes. Violent crimes also increase, but property crimes, no effect. So it can be two stories, no? As we know with crime, it can be that less formal human capital can lead you to higher adult crime. On this, there is a large literature. But it could also be the case, as I was saying, that it's not only that these kids are having less formal human capital, but are also entering into a criminal path and acquiring this criminal capital that is specific to this drug industry, which is the type of violent crime or drug trafficking. So how I see that there is evidence that criminal capital is important. First is that I only see that there are largest effects for these drug-related crimes, which are drug trafficking. I also see in transformation of cocaine to cocaine and violent crime. And then I also don't see any effects for individuals that were born in coca districts that sell for the legal sector. So for individuals that grew up, that they have the same geographical conditions as the other ones, that also work as a child in coca, but then in the long run, I don't see any effects on incarceration. And then I also check this with gold and coffee. In the case of coffee, it's not such a good placebo test because coffee, they don't use, basically they have the combinations complementary to adult labor, but for gold, it works as well, that we see an increase in child labor, but not effects in future incarceration. And then I also do these compliers and nice characteristics, and I check that most affected individuals that participated in legal activities due to the shock. Actually, they participated before the age of 18, and they reported farming as main occupation. Of course, ideally, what I want to have is in my incarceration data if they participated in coca farming, but that doesn't exist. So it seems that there is criminal capital that is important, and it's not only like that they are having less formal human capital, because if not, we would see also effects for those that were working and dropping out of school, but they were in coca districts that sell to the legal sector, but we don't see that. So right now, I show you all this part. So now let's try to think about a policy that targets the parental decision and dislocate coca areas. And for this, I use this conditional cash transfer that happened in the period 2005-2013. There is a lot of variation in the timing and also where it started across the district. So I'm going to exploit that. And what I find, this is the outcome of child labor. This is an event study just showing like what happens when I put the conditional cash transfer at the district level in these coca areas. And we see that there is a decline in child labor. And actually, I do the fully saturated model, the same as before, but interacting with whether they have access to this CCT. And we see that the effects are mitigated. And we also see the same with the schooling outcomes. And something important is that, yes, this was not randomly allocated. So basically, what we check is if there are differential effects based on if the districts were poorer or violent, and we don't see any differential effects. And actually, the trends were similar before the introduction of this policy. And for the years that I have very few years that I have coca production year by year. This goes from, I think, from 2010 onwards, that I have year by year the production. And what we see is actually something that makes sense. Children are an important input for coca farming. And now the CCT basically is increasing the cost, the price of this input, and this makes production decline. So you may be thinking, well, but this is the beginning, so they have margins. Yeah, of course, there is some substitution I see into adult labor. But this, again, will reduce future criminality because we see that older cohorts are less likely to be, captured by these groups to participate, like being backpackers or other things. And although here we have less power because we have very few cohorts that are affected by having the CCT and also born in these areas at the key ages, but it shows some areas that also effects are mitigated in criminality. So just to wrap up, I went very fast. So what I did in this paper is first to provide some evidence that this exposure to legal labor markets can perpetuate crime. Basically, individuals that are put on a high crime, low human capital path due to this increase in criminal capital during childhood. However, we also see that the conditional cash transfer that encourages schooling can mitigate these effects, potentially by changing parental incentives in these coca-suitable areas. The results help to understand how criminals start in these large illegal industry criminal careers, especially for people here. I think that the part that is confusing, I started with the story of El Chapo Guzman, which is the one that got it into the top. But I think that here in my data, what I'm seeing is possibly the ones that are in the bottom of this organization. I can also explain this puzzle that crime is concentrated in Latin America and the persistence maybe has to do with this suitability for this crop. And also to understand the role of alternative policies like conditional cash transfer to be used at key ages in these locations. It's something that nowadays they are discussing apart from enforcement alone. And something that I have not analyzed is how this criminal capital maybe can lead to other unexpected consequences, such as like the development of weak institutions that can happen. I haven't explored this in this paper. And we may think that this situation is very unique of Peru, but there are a lot of examples of illegal markets and children working in other contexts, like illegal gold mining in Ghana and also heroin cultivation in Afghanistan. And even though we think that child labor is something that is not that common in developing countries, children can still be exposed to legal industries and potentially develop criminal capital, even in the US. You can see this in certain parts of Chicago where kids are receiving, where the drug trade actually ends. So what this project tries is to suggest that by targeting a root cause of crime, such as this development of criminal capital, can break the persistence of illegal labor markets and associated crime for these kids. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mika. Thank you so much. I'm sure everybody is joining me in clapping remotely for you. Very nice presentation. And thank you for sticking to the time. You did a great job on that as well. So I have a couple of questions of my own, but I'll not abuse my position. So let me open a little bit to see if other people want to ask questions. So if anybody has a question, you can ask it directly. Just remember to unmute yourself, or you can send a chat if you prefer, and I can ask Mika. So let me just give a couple of seconds to see if somebody manifests themselves.
I can break the ice.
Break the ice, Paulo, please.
So, no, thanks. I mean, it was super presentation. So I just a couple of very minor questions. So one is, how do you explain the fact that you don't have an effect on grades for children that are a bit older, let's say? I mean, not really primary school, but secondary school. I mean, I understand they drop out. I mean, my guess would have been that maybe they even got worse grades. And the second one is, I think the graph about the timing of the effect by age at which you were exposed, it was really cool. I'm just struggling to understand. So this is the age of first exposure, okay? But so imagine you are first exposed when you are like also a bit older. I mean, why shouldn't you develop this effect or sorry, no, let me put differently. So I was wondering why you don't have an effect for kids that are initially exposed when they are very young, let's say 3 or 4 years, given that, you know, the production is going to be very persistent. So true, they are first exposed when they are 3 or 4, but they are also going to be exposed when they are 7, 8, 9, 10. So in these ages that are more crucial. So how do you rationalize that you don't have an effect for kids that are exposed at an earlier age? Sorry if I was a bit confused.
So yes, to do that, actually what I did in the paper is another strategy, which was the age at the time where we have the first boom. So I could know that if someone was 6 in 2000, since the shock was persistent after that, he will be also affected at the key ages of 11, 14. And for those, I see an effect as well. But in the strategy that I'm using right now, what basically I'm doing is exploiting individuals that, for instance, have an increase in high coca price at the age of 6, but then they didn't have at the other ages. So I also have those people because I'm including also a larger period, which comes from 1990s as well. So I'm exploiting also the other variation so that you have all this. And then in terms of intensive margin, actually, I thought that I was going, initially what I thought was happening is, okay, all these people are telling me that in Peru, and I actually see it in the sense that in these ages, 11, 14, you see a dropout. So if these kids, the bad ones, are dropping out, I should see an increase in intensive margin for the ones that I stay. But actually, I don't see any of that. There is no age for grade decline or even, well, the test scores, I don't have it because only have test scores for the younger kids. They don't do the national standardized test for the older kids that are in high school, so I cannot know. But at least for these other ones of whether they fail the grade, I don't see anything there, which I agree with you that is surprising because you would think that the bad ones are leaving and now the only ones that stay that I can see is a selected sample. I should see higher effect like good ones, positives.
Can I got disconnected for 1 second here. Can I follow up very quickly on Paulo's question? So, and as something that hadn't occurred to me, actually, given the profile of the price shocks, you have like a mixture of the timing and probably the duration of exposure, right? Can you disentangle this completely or not?
No, that's the only thing that I can do because I only have to do that, to disentangle completely that. Ideally, what I would want to have is year by year that data I have incarceration, but I only have it for 2 years. So I'm not able to do that. So the best I can do is define different, like the shock, like with this stuff, like the ages at the first one that I know that then it goes, still is persistent.
Okay, no, thank you. Anybody else? So I'll follow up with a question of my own then. So one thing that so this transition, I imagine like an illegal farmer must be almost like a farmer, right? It's just that
Yes.
probably you have a contact with these bad guys, right? These bad types. So can you characterize a little better, even like anecdotally, the transition from like a farmer who kind of flirts with illegal activities to this guy that actually becomes really a gang member? I think it's related to the process that you're calling like the accumulation of the criminal capital. So and then my question, just connecting to this point, is should we think of it like as accumulation of criminal capital in the sense of human capital, or maybe just development of this criminal social network, that you get to meet this guy since a very early age and you develop these relationships, and this actually is going to affect your choices in the future?
Yes, according to the last question, I cannot disentangle the two. It can be also that you meet people that put you in this drug industry, and I take it also as this criminal capital, what they are like teaching you. How you can see, like how you can picture this, how it works, and this is based on my experience in the field, I don't have the data for this, is that the kids basically, they collect the leaves. If the process would stop there, they would be okay, which that's what we see in the legal sector. But the problem comes that then they use these same kids to transport the leaves to the next stage. It's not that they come like big trucks to take all the leaves and then take it to, to transformation into cocaine paste. No, it's the same kids. And when they go to these locations, that's when they have the contact with all the criminal actors. And they also learn about the process. I have a lot of qualitative evidence on that, about people telling me their story, that once they were there, they saw how the business worked, how much they could earn. They also meet people that were in higher, like in the top, like kind of like, not like a Cachapo Guzman, but people that were having higher earnings. So they expect that they will also be the ones that will be having those earnings.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you.
No,
so
thank you.
Let's wait a little bit so people to see if people become a little less shy. Otherwise, I'm going to follow up with some questions.
Okay, no problem.
Let me give a couple of seconds for somebody to join in. Okay, so I'm going to follow up then. So the other thing that I was thinking, I like very much the characterization that you make with the shocks of any other commodity. We know that tends to increase child labor, like the short-run shocks, and this would kind of isolate more just the human capital channel. But in the end, it's kind of surprising that you don't find anything at all there, right? When you look at these other crops, right? Because this would mean that it's, in some sense, the surprising part would be that the fact that you're finding just the effect on child labor and dropping out by itself is not leading to any measurable crime at all, right? It's just really the connection and the criminal capital, right?
But think about it. If you think about a rural area in Peru, Brazil, and a kid that drop out of school, it's not that's going to follow. It's not. I think that when we think about crime in urban locations, you could think that, yeah, the kid will follow a crime, but here it's not the case. It's like the worst thing that can happen is that it will be a farmer all his life, like, but it's not that it will be like attracted to these industries.
No, I think it makes sense, the distinction. Yeah, I hadn't thought about the rural urban distinction. I think that's a good point. And definitely makes sense. Yeah. So we still have a couple of minutes if there is any additional question. If Paulo has any other comment as well, or anybody else.
I mean, it's not really a question, but I would really like to see something like that for Italy at some point. I don't know if anybody's going to do that, right? I mean, there's a lot of books and even novels about these kids born in some neighborhood of Naples, that they are Naples or other cities in the south, that they are kind of, I don't know, deemed to become like that, right? But this is, of course, just anecdotal evidence. I mean, you are just born in the wrong place, from the wrong family, and I don't know, I cannot imagine of any clean shock like the one you mentioned, the one you exploit in your paper, which is really clean and convincing. But I mean, I'm sure at some point somebody is coming up with some analysis like that. I mean, it would be worth,
Yes.
because, yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so if there are not any other questions, thank you so much, Mika. It's really a very,
No, thank you all
I
for
find it a very impressive piece of work, super, super relevant and super nice as well. So congratulations, thank you. And so let's move on to Paulo's paper that's actually on Brazil, right? And on a different type of economic opportunity, right? The non-criminal economic opportunities. And
okay, can you see my screen?
yeah, it's just not full. Can you blow
Yeah,
it up,
yeah.
Paulo? Full screen?
I'm trying. Okay. Like
yes,
this.
it did work. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot for having me here. It's really an honor to present in this invited session, and together with Mika, and thanks to Rodrigo for organizing. So the paper I'm going to present today is joint work with my two great Brazilian co-authors, so Diogo Brito, who is with me at Bocconi University and the Clean Center for the Economic Analysis of Crime, and Breno Sampaio, that is the Federal University of Pernambuco and runs the GAPE Center. So, and this is a paper about the effect of economic conditions on the individual probability of committing crimes, and how such relationship, I mean, if there is a relationship, is mediated by some public policies, like specifically unemployment insurance. So if you want to trace back this hypothesis, you can go very long back in time. So for instance, Aristotle used to say that poverty is the mother of crime, which is a very effective way of stating the role and the importance of economic conditions for the decision to engage in criminal behavior. So more than 2,000 years later, Gary Becker formalized this idea in, let's say, the usual jargon of economists by this super famous paper in the JP in 1968, in which he really has this simple model by which a decrease in employment opportunities, like it can happen in economic downturns or unemployment crisis, like the one we are living right now, also decreases the opportunity cost of committing crimes. So your risk that you take when you commit some crime, and this in turn increases the probability of committing crimes. Now we are going to estimate this mechanism for the case of Brazil, which is arguably an interesting context to look at. I mean, not just within this conference, but in general. So, as you know, Latin America is unfortunately the continent with the highest crime rates and the most violent areas in the world. So, in these graphs, I take homicide rate, which is possibly the only measure of crime that is fully comparable across countries. And I mean, it's quite surprising that the homicide rate, the average homicide rate in South America, which hovers between 20 and 25 per 100,000, is like twice as much the homicide rate in Africa, which we tend to think is a much less developed country. So in this other graph, we distinguish a bit between the different countries in Latin America, and it's interesting to see that the homicide rate in Brazil tracks very closely the average homicide rate in Latin America. Okay? So Brazil is very representative of the most violent continent in the world. This is some preliminary evidence. So on these two graphs, we plot the evolution of the homicide rate since the 1990s and of the male employment rate. And as you can see, the two variables are strongly inverse related. Okay? As you can see also from this graph, there's almost a perfect relationship. When the employment rate, the male employment rate increases, the homicide rate decreases. Okay, so this seems some first evidence supporting the Becker model, or this idea that economic conditions are important for the decision to commit crime. Of course, this is still preliminary evidence. I mean, both variables can respond to some secular trends. They can respond to other omitted factors. So the only way to go deeper into this relationship, to identify more clearly this relationship, is to use individual level data. I mean, that's a very convincing type of data set that we are going to use. We're going to use matched employment and crime data at the individual level for the universe of workers in Brazil. And we are going to look in particular at two main shocks. So one is job loss. So what happens when male workers lose their job? So there's a drop in earning. It takes time to get back to a new job. So this is a moment in which the opportunity cost of committing crime is very low, and these people may be more at risk of committing crime. And second, as I mentioned at the very beginning, the role of unemployment insurance. So whether unemployment insurance can cushion the impact of job loss during the period in which workers don't have a job. And we will try to exploit this very rich data that we have available to discuss at least some potential mechanisms. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that we cannot really say it's 100% this mechanism or these two mechanisms, but we can provide evidence in favor or against some of these mechanisms, like changes in the opportunity cost of crime, which is the mechanism emphasized by Becker. Liquidity constraint, which is a very similar economic mechanism. Okay, you lose your job, if you don't have savings, you need to bring something on the table, and maybe you're going to commit some type of crime. Another potential mechanism is changes in leisure time. So if you think about that, your job also exerts an incapacitation effect. Okay, so when you are in your office for 8, 9, 10 hours per day, or you are in the factory during this period, I mean, you have very few opportunities of committing crimes. When you are unemployed, you spend most of your time in the streets or around with other people, and you may be even randomly matched to more employment opportunities. So we try to, criminal opportunities. So we try to see whether this is also part of the explanation. And finally, we're going to discuss also the role of psychological stress. Okay, so you get fired by your boss, you're pissed off, and you may end up committing something stupid, even if it has really no economic return. So the data that I was mentioning were put together by the collaboration of these two research institutes, one at the University of Pernambuco and the other one at Bocconi University. It's a very rich data set, and we think it's also important because maybe for the first time, this rich data are available for a country with very high level of crimes. Okay, so I mean, Brazil really ranks on top, as we saw before, of homicide rates in the world. In 2019, it was the 6th one in terms of highest homicide rates. I mean, we have this amazing public registry data for Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands, and Norway. That's great, but these are countries at the opposite of the spectrum in terms of violence and homicide rate. There's something for the US, which has a higher homicide rate than Scandinavia for sure, than northern country Europe for sure, but still the coverage is still limited. It's just 12 out of 50 states. And anyway, even the United States are not comparable to the level of violence that you observe in Brazil or in other Latin American countries. So let me talk quickly about the previous evidence. So Rodrigo has a very nice paper about the impact of economic conditions on crime, exploiting tariff liberalization in Brazil. There are similar papers for other countries that exploit aggregate data across regions or cities and achieve identification by the means of shift share instruments. Okay, so they distribute across regions or cities some national levels shock, like total spending by the governments or tariff liberalization, like in the case of Rodrigo's paper, or this sort of things. I mean, these papers are typically very convincing. I mean, one limitation you have with aggregate data is that it's hard to explore the mechanism. Okay, so Actually, there are a few recent papers that are similar to ours in terms of using individual level data. So there's one for Danish workers that lost their job in the beginning of the 90s because of the crisis in Europe. There's another paper by Rose on previously convicted offenders in Washington state. So this is just for one state in the US, and it's about people recidivating, not about first offenders. There's another paper with Norwegian registry data. And finally, the paper that is closest to ours is a paper by Kana and several other co-authors in which they look at the universe of workers in the city of Medellin. So the context here is more similar to the one we are looking at, but they have data just on a single city and not on the entire country in Colombia. Okay, so we believe that our paper is the first one that combines data on the universe of workers in a large country with very high crime level. We also incorporate some recent methodological advancements. So like all these new papers about staggered diff in diffs to estimate dynamic treatment effects. I'm not going to spend too much on this, but I'm going to talk a bit more if there's time about machine learning methods, so causal forest that we use to estimate heterogeneous treatment effects. So we see that the impact of job loss can be very heterogeneous across different types of agents. Our data also allow us to estimate spillover effects on other family members. And finally, we think another advantage is that we have a very clean quasi-experimental design, a regression discontinuity design to study the effect of unemployment insurance. So all these advantages of our data or the institutional design we are looking at allow us, as I mentioned before, some discussion of mechanisms. So finally, the data. So the first building block is this max employer-employee administrative data for the universe of workers in Brazil. The RAIS data that I'm sure many of you have used before. So we are going to consider the time period 2009-2017 because this is the period for which we have available the crime data. This is a typical administrative data set. So we know the worker's name, the firm ID. Actually, it's not typical in the sense that the worker's name is typically not provided in the administrative data for other countries, but it's included in RAIS. We know the earnings, the occupation. We are talking about more or less 100 million workers observed during this period, and 60 million employment spells and 10 million layoffs per year. Okay, so something I learned while working on this paper is that there's really a lot of turnover in the Brazilian labor market. Okay, so every year you have a lot of hiring and firing of workers. So the second piece of the data set is the population of criminal cases that were filed during the period I mentioned before, 2009 and 2017. Okay, so I'm talking about 15 million cases, and in this case we also know the name of the defendant. We have some other information about the location in which the crime was committed. One important information we have is that we can identify crimes that were prosecuted in flagrante. Okay, so in which the offender was caught while committing the crime. And this is particularly good because it addresses some concerns about the differential reporting or prosecution of people with different characteristics, in particular people that are employed or unemployed. And also for these cases, we have a precise information of the timing of the offense because these people are immediately prosecuted. We exclude crimes that are related to domestic violence because in this case, we think that the possibility of underreporting is more severe than for other types of crime, okay? Because the decision of the partner to report the crime may depend on the employment status of the husband or of the wife, but yeah, it's almost always the husband, of course, the one committing the violence. So we have an ongoing project with with the same co-authors and Sonia Balot, in which we are trying to address these additional issues. But for this paper, we are not considering cases of domestic violence. So how do we combine these two sources of data? Well, we have the name and the surname in both data sets, so that's what we use. Of course, there's a risk of measurement error, okay? So both type 1 and type 2 errors, but in this case, we are lucky because you guys in Brazil have several surnames, okay? So compared to other countries, the probability of finding another person with exactly the same name and the same combination of surnames is pretty low, okay? So if you were considering Italy, you would find, I'm sure, hundreds or thousands of Paolo Pinotti, but if you take my co-authors, Diogo, Castro, De Brito, and maybe something else, I mean, it's much harder to find somebody with the same name and combination of surnames. Okay, so we have some other registry data by which we can identify people in the Brazilian population that have a unique combination of names and surnames. Okay, so if you take the whole country, this is about 50% of the people in Brazil. Okay, so in our main analysis, we are going to restrict to this half of the Brazilian population. We have also an extended sample.
Paulo,
that,
can I?
Yeah. Sure.
Can I just ask a clarification question? Why is it that you don't use age as part of the matching?
Yeah, we could. Well, I actually think the age is not reported in the criminal data. So we have age in RAIS, but we don't have in the criminal records, or at least sometimes it's reported, sometimes it's not. So that's something we cannot use. So I was saying we have an extended sample in which we can include also everybody with a unique name within each state. Okay, so if we find two Diogo, Castro, De Brito in different states, we assume they are a different person. If they are in the same state, we assume they are the same person. Okay, so in this way, we get to cover 70% of the Brazilian population, and the results are actually almost identical. One bigger problem, if you want, is that the name is missing from the criminal prosecution data. About 45% of these criminal records, the name is not reported. Okay, this is a problem, of course. It's a problem of the way in which these data were collected. We cannot do much about this, but we saw that it varies tremendously across states. For some states and some jurisdictions, there's a very low incidence of missing names. For others, there's a lot. So when we restrict the sample to states with a higher share of no missing data, the results are very robust. Okay? And that's all we can do, I think, to address this concern. Okay, so let me go to the preliminary evidence. This is the total number of recorded offenses by gender and age, and as most of you probably know already, criminal activity peaks in the people are teenagers. Actually, here I mean, just people that are adults, so 18 or both are reported. This is just some measurement error, and it peaks when people are around 20, and then it declines over time. The other thing that you see from this graph is that females commit very few crimes. So as it is often the case in this paper, we just restrict the sample to males. Here we distinguish the probability of being criminally prosecuted in a year by age and by whether you were continuously employed during the year or you were displaced in the same year. Okay, and from this graph, you see already that for people that are displaced at those ages in which crime peaks, the probability of committing a crime is twice as much the probability for people that are continuously employed. But of course, this is both due to the causal effect, potential causal effect of job loss, and also selection. Okay, so to isolate the former from the latter, we perform the following event study approach. So we focus on workers that were displaced during the period 2012-2014, so in the central years of our sample period, so we can observe the probability of committing crime in previous years as a placebo and the probability of committing crime in the following year to estimate dynamic treatment effects. And we are going to match this sample of displaced workers to a control group of workers that are not displaced in the same year, but they can displace in year T+1 or T+2. and that work in the same state. They have the same age, the same tenure, the same income. They work in the same industry and in a firm with approximately the same size. Okay, so we match these displaced workers with a control group that is observational equivalent, and we compare the two before and after displacement. And to be sure that we are really isolating exogenous variation in employment status, we are going to focus most of the analysis on mass layoffs. Okay, so in these events, a big part of the firm labor force, so at least 1/3 of the labor force, but we can increase to 50%, 75%, and so on and so forth. We also consider plant closure. So these are exogenous events that don't really depend on the particular behavior of a specific worker. Okay, and this is done to avoid this case by which, let's say, you know that a worker is committing some type of crime, so you fire the worker. Okay. This can be for individual layoffs, but this is hardly the case when there is a mass layoff. A mass layoff is something that depends on some exogenous shock at the sector level or at the city level or things like that. So when you match treated and controls on these characteristics, and then you can check the balance in other characteristics like race or years of education, which are variables we are not matching treated and controls on, you see that the difference is very small. Okay, so the standardized difference is always below this cautionary threshold of 0.25, 0.30, except for the case of mass layoffs when you consider years of education. But still, if you look at the absolute difference here, it's not that large. The equation that we're going to estimate is a typical econometric specification for estimating dynamic treatment effects. So we interact a dummy for being one of these displaced workers with the dummy for 1 year after the displacement, 2 years after, 3 years after, and so on and so forth. And we are also going to control for time times municipality times industry fixed effect. Okay, so this is a robustness to check that actually matching just by state and by 1-digit industry is enough to remove all these unobserved factors. Okay, so this combination of fixed effect, they are tighter, okay, because these are 5,600 municipalities, and these are 2-digit industries rather than 1-digit industries. But I'm going to show you that including or excluding this interacted fixed effect makes absolutely no difference for the result. Okay, so the matching procedure seems enough to remove omitted factors. And then we are also going to estimate a simpler equation by which we just compare the probability of committing crime before and after the treatment, okay, the job loss, just to come up with an average number in the post period. Okay, so this is a measure of the treatment if you want. So here we are estimating the impact of job loss on the probability of being employed 1 year after being displaced for the treated compared to the controls, 2 years, 3 years, and 4 years. Okay, and what you see is that actually that there's a 30% drop in the probability of being employed 1 year after the job loss. Okay, so this means that some of the workers that were displaced, they got back to a new job, and some of the controls workers, they also lost their job. Okay, so the difference is not 100% after 1 year, but it has shrunk already to 30% because, as I said before, there's a very lot of turnover in the Brazilian labor market. But still, after that point, the convergence is quite slow. Okay, and actually, if you look at labor income, the drop is much more severe. It drops by 70%, and then it recovers very slowly. Okay, so this means that actually these people are moving to worse jobs in most cases. Okay, but then let's go to the main outcome of interest, which is the probability of committing crime. So this axis is always relative to the baseline probability of committing a crime, which is also indicated in each graph. So the probability of committing a crime increased by more than 20% in 1 year after job loss, and then it remains more or less constant afterwards. The effect is larger for economically motivated crimes, okay, so as you should expect, but actually it's quite interesting that there's also a sizable effect on the probability of committing violent crimes, okay, so this is something pretty new. Most previous papers, they just identify an effect on economic crimes. One reason could be because violent crimes, they are very rare, okay, so here we have in an advanced position because we are exploiting data for a very large country. So we have enough power to identify this 15–20% increase in violent crime. Of course, sorry, some of these violent crimes may be instrumental to committing economic crimes, but I will try to show you that some crimes that seem to be purely violent, they also increase. And this points at the importance of psychological stress, as I mentioned at the beginning. And then here there's a residual category of other crimes. So just to put some numbers, let's keep it simple. So just look at the red numbers here. So in the post period, there's an average over the 4 years after job loss, employment drops by 20% and earnings by 40%. And the probability of committing any type of crime increased by 26%. It's higher, as I said, for economic crimes, lower for violent crimes. But anyway, there's a strongly significant effect on all these categories. And here, this is just an implied elasticity of the probability of crime to earnings. But okay, let's keep that. Now, here in this table, I was considering all layoffs. The interesting thing is that when you focus just on mass layoffs, the effects are exactly identical, okay? So this is reassuring in terms of the robustness of our result, that they don't depend on other omitted factors. It's also a bit surprising because you may think when you displace 100 workers, you know, there may be some social multipliers in crimes or something like that. So the effect may be large, but actually we don't detect anything like that, okay? So we search a lot in the data for this type of multipliers, but we couldn't identify anything like that. And here, as I mentioned before, you include a very tight set of municipality times here times industry fixed effects. So you are keeping constant any you know, transitory shock to a specific industry in a specific city, and again, the effects are identical. So when you distinguish between different types of economic, violent, and other crimes, you see that more or less all types of crime react. Okay. So for instance, when you look at violent crimes, you have an effect on murders. Okay, you may say some murders are instrumental to committing robbery. Okay, so this could still be economic crimes. But in the data, we are able to distinguish murders that are committed together with some other type of crime, or murders that are committed with no other type of crime. So we think that the second one, they are, I mean, these violent murders, they are purely violent crimes, and they also increase significantly, okay? And then you have also an increase in these types of crime, like small drug possession, failure to obey to a police officers. I mean, some of these things that they really, they don't have a clear economic motivation, okay? So they may be more of a symptom of some, you know, worsening mental health or psychological stress or something like that.
Paulo, yeah. 5 minutes. Huh?
Oh, okay. I managed to be very late. So let me skip on the robustness checks. Here, I just want to show you this graph in which we replicate.
Paulo, we saved a little bit of time on Mika's presentation, so you can go a little bit over time, so you can pass a little the 5 minutes just to calibrate your own presentation.
Thanks, and thanks, Mika. So here in this right graph, I focus just on flagrante cases. So and we replicate the analysis at the monthly level, and you see that the results are qualitatively very similar. Okay, so even when you restrict to crimes, to offenders that are prosecuted in flagrante, okay, so there's no underreporting issue, and we have a precise measure of the timing of the crime. The results, they seem very similar. Okay, let me show you the results of the heterogeneity analysis.
Paulo, yeah. Just one clarifying question that I should have asked before. So here is a layoff, but then they go back. Do you know? So you can see if they go back, no? How long? you did something with that.
No, we didn't really do anything with that because this is quite endogenous, right? So we just take an intention to treat approach. So you are laid off, then you may commit some crime. You may also go back to work, but we don't really. Okay. Then for the heterogeneity analysis, we implement this causal forest approach. This is quite a conventional method by now in machine learning in order to try all the possible combinations of the other covariates that can explain the size of the treatment effect. In order to avoid overfitting, you split the sample in two and use one part of the sample to estimate and the other part of the sample to validate the estimate that you obtain with the first sample. Okay, so in this way you avoid overfitting and you also retain a lot of flexibility in the estimation of nonlinear effect. It's a totally data-driven approach, so it's less prone to discretion by the researcher. So this is the distribution of the heterogeneous treatment effect. It starts from, I mean, these people have very low treatment effect, these people have very high treatment effect, but still all the treatment effect, they are positive, okay, which is quite reassuring. There's nobody with a negative treatment effect. When you try to distinguish the determinants of the size of the treatment effect, age is important and tenure is important, okay? So it's younger workers that react the most and workers with lower tenure. So this may be the workers with lower accumulated savings. And so this points at the importance of liquidity constraints. Another surprising result is that actually there's no heterogeneity by local conditions. So we tried with several local characteristics like the homicide rate, the informality rate, the sector growth, the occupation growth rate, income per capita, Gini index, nothing at all. So when you combine two dimensions at the time and you estimate the effect by the size of age and tenure, you get this very clear picture by which younger workers and workers with lower tenure, they have the highest treatment effect, and then the treatment effect decreases in value when you increase age and when you increase tenure. While instead, when you try, for instance, with homicide rate and the informality rate, let's say the two most important local characteristics to explain the heterogeneity in the treatment effect on crime, you get this messy heat map by which there's really no clear pattern. Okay, let me skip this. The sake of time. So we find that people react to job loss and the reaction is larger for younger and low tenure workers. So here there's a mistake. So the possible mechanisms are some opportunity cost a la Becker, liquidity effect, time substitution, and also we mentioned psychological stress. Now we try to understand the effect of time substitution by looking at evidence from the effect of unemployment benefits, okay? So we basically compare two workers that are displaced from the firm, and some of these workers, they receive unemployment benefits, unemployment insurance, and some workers do not, okay? So all these workers, they are unemployed, so they spend time at home or in the streets or whatever. And the only thing that varies is how much money they receive from the state to cushion the effect of a job loss, okay? So unemployment insurance is actually quite generous. In Brazil, the replacement rate is 80%. It lasts between 3 and 5 months. And the eligibility requirement, which you're going to exploit to estimate its effect, is that you must wait 16 months since the previous layoff in which you asked for unemployment insurance. Okay, so this is a neither regression discontinuity design. We can compare workers that were displaced just above 16 months and just below 16 months cutoff. Okay, in principle, there could be manipulation if the workers agrees with the firm to manipulate the threshold, but we show there is not. In this particular sample, we show that workers are balanced. We show that worker characteristics are balanced. We show the probability of criminal prosecution 1 semester before and 3 years before is balanced. But when you look at the first semester after being displaced, those that receive unemployment insurance, which are these workers above the cutoff, they commit slightly less crime than workers that didn't receive unemployment insurance. Okay. However, the effect vanishes away pretty soon, already 1 or 2 years after the job loss. So when unemployment insurance expires, you no longer have a difference in the crime rate between the two. Okay, so if we replicate the heterogeneity analysis, it's once again the younger workers. So this is a picture for 29 years old or less. You see a clear difference of a discontinuity, while for older workers there's no difference. Okay. So since I'm running a bit over time, let me just mention that if you rescale this difference in the reduced form effect here, here, and you rescale by the take-up of unemployment insurance, you get the local average treatment effect of unemployment insurance, which is about 28% reduction in the probability of committing crime, which is about the same magnitude of the increasing crime that we observe in the analysis of the effect of job loss. Okay, so during this very first month after a job loss, unemployment insurance is able to actually kill the effect of job loss to avoid the increasing crime. However, the problem is that the effect vanishes away at the benefit expiration. Okay, so when these people lose the paycheck from the government, they go back to committing crime. Okay, so these are the conclusions. Since I'm a bit over time, I just let you with these slides here. Thank you.
Thank you, Paulo. Thank you so much for the presentation. And I'm gonna, to break the ice, I think I'm gonna start this time around. So a very nice presentation, very nice paper. You know, I already know this paper from before, and I like it a lot. So one thing that I was thinking in your more kind of conceptual discussion, I had a hard time distinguishing what you're calling the kind of opportunity cost Beckerian story from the liquidity story and from the time substitutability stories. I think these are all opportunity cost stories, right? It's just that they unless I didn't understand it very clear. So if you wanna, can you extend a little bit the discussion?
Yeah, sorry, I was very fast on a few things. Okay, so for instance, an additional piece of evidence which I skipped is the effect on the other family members. Okay, so actually we find an effect for the cohabiting youth, which is comparable in relative terms to the effect that we find on the worker that lost the job. Okay, so we think it's evidence in favor of the liquidity constraint. Okay, so they live in the same household, and at some point they run out of money. Is weaker evidence for the opportunity cost, in the sense that, you know, the future employment opportunities, the expected cost of committing crimes for these cohabiting youth may change, of course, when the father get arrested, but it should change by less, and still we find that the effect is very similar in magnitude. And actually it's evidence against the time substitution, okay? Because I mean, for these people, the time they spend around, or the time they are incapacitated in school or in the job, it would actually be the same, to be unaffected. And another evidence against the time substitution, I mean, I think this time substitution thing is really the thing that we can exclude, because remember, we have that actually people that receive unemployment insurance, they commit less crime after job loss, okay? But actually these people, they tend to go back to work later. Okay, as it usually happens when you receive an unemployment insurance, you postpone, you know, your reservation wage is higher, so you spend more time searching for a good job or trying to get a higher salary and so on. Okay, so unemployment duration is higher, months work in the first semester are lower, so they actually spend more time around and less time at work. Now, of course, you could say, okay, there could be a time substitution effect which goes in the opposite direction, but at least we can say that it's a weaker effect or a less relevant effect than the economic effects. Okay, so I think most of the paper points at the importance of economic effects. We are not really able to distinguish one from the other one, although the liquidity constraint, it seems very important, even when you look at the effect by age or by tenure, or things like that. And there's some evidence that psychological stress plays a role, but this thing of time substitution doesn't seem so relevant.
I think I got now what you meant by the time substitution in the sense of the almost mechanical effect of incapacitation or something like that. But in terms of the liquidity and the opportunity cost, when I think about opportunity cost, I think about it in relative terms, right? The opportunity cost vis-a-vis the potential return from crime, right? In this sense that the liquidity constraint and the opportunity cost are kind of the same thing, right? The two sides of a cost-benefit analysis, right?
They are similar, but I think, for instance, if you think again about this heterogeneity by age, the opportunity cost of committing crime for a young worker is much higher. Because, I mean, if you are arrested once when you're young, it's very hard for you to find a new job in the future, okay? So actually, you are foregoing more earnings than somebody that is maybe 40. And still we find actually we find an effect just on the youth in many of these specifications, okay? So the youth, again, they have a higher opportunity cost. At the same time, they have more stringent liquidity constraints. So that's why we tend to think that liquidity constraints, they are more in line with several of these results.
Okay, let me open up. So Mika has a question.
Yes, so I got lost a bit about this result that I found it very interesting, that you found on violence that is not instrumental to robberies.
Yeah.
And I was wondering whether this is something also specific of the context of Brazil that you have, and maybe it's because this is related to the criminal market, that maybe once you also have this option of joining a criminal organization, like all these drug groups that are there or gangs, and that's why you are seeing also this violent increase in murders that are not instrumental to robberies.
Sorry, I lost the last part. I think there was a problem with my connection. No, you say you have these gangs and then...
So what I was wondering to explain, because I was very surprised about this on the increase once you are laid off, on the increase in violent crimes that are not instrumental. And I was wondering if this could be explained by these people maybe like now joining one of these criminal organizations because they are young. So they kick me out from my work and now I have this opportunity that I was not going to take, and that's why I'm seeing.
No, yeah, I guess in principle, yeah, that is possible. So again, we try to exclude this case by looking at people that were prosecuted just for committing a murder. Okay, so I guess if you were in one of these gangs, you may be prosecuted for murder, and maybe criminal association or drug trafficking or something like that. Of course, there's the possibility that these people are arrested and they just don't, they don't report the other members of the gang, or they don't speak to the police, and so they're just, this we cannot really exclude. I mean, we don't have a perfect measure of, actually, so in the other paper, we are looking at domestic violence, and domestic violence increased by a lot. So this is clearly non-instrumental and really driven just by psychological stress. And I think it's traffic violation. I mean, I don't know what you want to do about that. It's maybe, it's not a huge effect. And maybe you may say, okay, who cares about traffic violation? But it could also be a symptom of stress, of disorder in your life. Yes. Of course, it's something different from committing a murder, right? But it's just to say these people, they are not behaving anymore in many dimensions after they lose their job. It's not like they are computers that they say, okay, now I don't have these earnings and I need to compensate with criminal earnings. I mean, there's this part, but there's also something more probably.
So let me open. So I think Vinicius had a question. No.
Yeah, I do have a question actually. I think like complementing Mika's question. So have you done heterogeneity by region or geographical region or states or something that probably is driving the results?
Yeah, I mean, it's here. So there's not much. So actually, we tried first by state, but then in the spirit of this, data-driven approach, machine learning, we got this data at the municipality level, and we just let the data speak. Okay, and we just let the algorithm find whether there is a significant difference in the effect between places with high and low homicide rate, high and low informality rate, and all the possible combination of these variables. And actually, there's nothing. So it's something that we found surprising and also interesting, right? So it's like there's something innate in people that it's it's pushing them to commit something wrong when they lose your job. Okay, and maybe one of the reasons is that I guess 99%, well, no, maybe that's too much, but let's say, I don't know, 80% or 90% of these people, they are not professional criminals. They are like normal workers, they get fired, they run out of money, maybe they have kids to feed, and they do something wrong in order to solve this problem, just as I mentioned before, because they are stressed. It's not that they are really, attracted by gangs after they lose their job, or at least that doesn't seem to be a big part of the explanation. Actually, we don't have a good mapping of the criminal gangs in Brazil, like you have, for instance, in Mexico or in other countries. So we are working a bit on that. So we use the homicide rate as a proxy. So in many countries, the high homicide rate is the best proxy for the presence of criminal gangs.
And I was seeing that here, the fact that you don't find anything with informality, that's also reassuring that it's not, because in general, I tend to be located in informal places that have more informal labor markets. So, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Yes, Julia.
Ciao, Julia.
I felt cold when you know.
Former student.
My question is you find that your effects are more concentrated on young people and people that have lower tenure. And I was wondering if you could find a way to see if it's also due to the fact that people that got exposed more to the workplace tends also to have more linkages with unions, etc. So when they find out that they do not have anymore a job, they can restore and like channel their stress into more structured forms of protest, like political protest, etc. While young people that do not get through this process because they get fired when they are young, they just have these violent outbreaks. And so I don't know if in the crime data you can see if there is some ways to track political crimes due to political unrest, and you may expect them to be higher for adults. I don't know, and find no of that in the younger population.
No, yeah, thanks. I think it's an interesting hypothesis. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that in order to end up in our criminal records for a political crime, you need to do something quite serious, okay, which would maybe go a bit against the fact that we find that it is younger people that commit crime. I think it's more interesting in general terms, the fact that older people, yeah, they probably have a wider network of support from the worker unions in Brazil or from some other worker association. Now, I don't know enough about these issues, admittedly, but yeah, we can think about that with my co-authors. I'm not even sure we have the data to identify an explanation like that, but yeah, for sure it's possible in principle, I think. Yeah. Thanks.
Any other questions? There is a question here in the chat. Paulo Vaz sent a question.
Okay.
He's saying basically, I wonder how important are the cases from people that at some point were formally employed. In other words, what is the baseline? Would that be the case that now we know more about the cases that explain few of the crime we see out there? I think he's asking to what extent what you're finding is a driving force of the level of crime in Brazil or not, right? So whether it's telling a big part of the story in terms of overall crime, but you can't say anything about it, right?
No, maybe we could provide some back of the envelope calculation, but in any case, I think, you know, these effects are large, okay, in relative terms. Then again, these people are not whatever Pablo Escobar or El Chapo. So I mean, 24% increase in the probability of committing crime maybe doesn't mean too much. I mean, the baseline was 0.05. Sorry, 0.005. Okay, so 0.5% probability of committing a crime in a given year. So yeah, again, it's a small effect, but maybe on a large number of workers, because every year, you know, millions of these workers are fired. So I think it's, I mean, it's something worth investigating, and especially from a policy perspective, it's important to think about how to reduce this probability of engaging in crime. I mean, in the very first month for people that are not covered by unemployment insurance, and also afterwards for people that are covered, but they are covered just for a few months, and then it seems they go back to committing crime like the other ones.
Thank you, Paulo. We are actually slightly over time, so if there is somebody has one final question, just one. Otherwise, I think we close the session. Any final question? I think there was one more. Oh no, yeah. I think we should stop here because we're already 2 minutes over time. I ask everybody to join me in thanking Mika and Paulo for a really outstanding session. Super nice academic work, and super nice, super relevant to Brazil, obviously, and to people interested in the economics of crime. It was a pleasure to see you guys again, both of you, unfortunately, remotely. And I promise that I'm gonna find a way over the next few years to bring both of you physically here to give a talk or organize some conference.
I'll be there.
We can interact.
Yes. Thank you, Rodrigo and the audience.
Thank you so much. These are really very nice papers, both of your papers. It's great to see such good work being done in economics of crime and with Latin American data, generally speaking, right? In both cases, right? Brazil and Peru. Thank you, guys.
Thank you for inviting us, and thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.